Alright, today we will be covering Lesson 6-1, Key Features of Graphs. As you can see, there is a big intro section, so I'm going to read through that real quick. It says, roller coasters can be scary but fun to ride. Below is the graph of the heights reached by the cars of the Thunderball roller coaster over its first 1,250 feet of track. The graph displays a function because each input value has one and only one output value. You can see this visually using the vertical line test. Study this graph to determine the domain and range. The vertical line test is a visual check to see if the graph represents a function. For a function, every vertical line drawn in the coordinate plane will intersect the graph in at most one point. This is equivalent to having each domain element associated with one and only one range element. The domain gives all values of the independent variable, in this case, the distance along the track in feet. The domain values are graphed along the horizontal or x-axis. The domain of the function above can be written in set notation as all real values of x such that 0 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 1,250. The other way to read this would be the set of all real values of x between 0 and 1,250 inclusive. The range gives the values of dependent variables, in this case the height of the roller coaster above the ground in feet. The range values are graphed on the vertical or y-axis. The range on the function above can be written in set notation as all real values of y, 10 less than or equal to y, which is less than or equal to 110. Read this notation as the set of all real values of y between 10 and 110 inclusive. And over here off to the side, it just notes that an independent variable is the variable for which the input are substituted. The dependent value is determined by what the input value was. The graph above shows data that are continuous. The points in the graph are connected, indicating that the domain and range are sets of real numbers with no breaks in between. A graph of discrete consists of individual points that are not connected by a line or a curve. Many other useful pieces of information about a function can be determined by looking at the graph. The y-intercept of the function is the point at which the function intersects the y-axis. The y-intercept is the point at which x equals 0. A relative maximum of a function is the greatest value for values in an open domain interval. A relative minimum is the least value of f of x for values in a limited open domain interval. Because they must occur within open intervals of the domain, relative max and mins cannot correspond to endpoints of the graph. Use the Thunderball roller coaster graph on the previous page for items 1 through 5. Number 1 says, what is the y-intercept of the function shown in the graph and what does it represent? Well, the y-intercept is where it crosses the y-axis. So that is saying that at 0 distance along the track, we're at 10 feet above the ground. So the y-intercept is 0, 10. And it basically tells us at 0 feet along the track, the height of the roller coaster is 10 feet above the ground. Let's take a look at 2. Identify a relative maximum for the function represented by the graph. Now, relative maximum means a maximum over a certain domain, means that it can't be our endpoints. Well, we have 2 relative maximums. This right here is a relative max, and this right here is a relative max. So we had right here looks to be 110 feet high, and here looks to be about 90. So 110 and 90. Identify the absolute maximum of the function represented by the graph and interpret its meaning in the context of this situation. Okay. Absolute means the highest point that it reaches altogether. Well, that would be the 110. So we would put 110, the greatest height the roller coaster reached. Identify a relative minimum. Well, we have one relative min. This is a relative min. These 2 are not relative mins because they are endpoints. Your endpoints cannot be relative max or mins. So, relative min looks to be, that value was at 30. It says identify your absolute minimum. Now, those can be your endpoints. And that would have been 10. And the least height, the roller coaster reached. On to your debriefing.